Ian, it is great to talk to you. Thank you so much for calling in. You've been at Instagram, as you mentioned, for 6 years. Your role continues to evolve every time we talk. Every year it's a different role. Can you talk a little bit about how the focus has changed for you over the years?
Yeah, I think like in the early phases at Instagram, we had like a pretty small team, about like less than 10 people. So a lot of the challenge there was trying to scale out a team, a very talented team, a team that was known for putting out great work. And so that's where my energy went into, just thinking about how do you scale that out in a company that's growing really quickly. The number of products the team is working on, challenges the team is working on is growing really quickly. And so all of my effort went into that. And so that's not just thinking about recruiting, but it's also thinking about team process and team culture and those sorts of things, and trying to see around the next corner constantly. So really about the health of the function of design within Instagram. And I think the things that has shifted is I've gone a bit deeper into both thinking about what we should build as opposed to kind of how we should build it, and thinking about a particular market, but then also thinking about the health of other functions. So not just thinking about design, but thinking about a full stack team and how we can make that team successful. And also kind of collaborating with people who are in the business functions, whether it's like on the sales side, marketing side, that sort of thing.
So reflecting back in these last couple of years, and you might not have had that much of an opportunity to do that, but I'm going to ask anyways. This is like, what have been some of your biggest design challenges that you've had to overcome?
I think the biggest design challenge recently is less of like a product design challenge and much more about just, how do you design your working model during a pandemic, when the world is basically falling, right? How do you lead a team that way? Like all of I feel like my tools, my native tools to understand what's happening with the team and kind of managing a team, communicating with team are all really based on being physically with people all the time, or most of the time at least, right? And so that you take that away, and that's one aspect. It's like, okay, we have to kind of reset and rethink how I kind of communicate and how I get a sense of how people are doing, and just the whole rhythm of the day kind of gets blown up. But then there's the other piece of like when you've got the weight of global pandemic weighing on people, and you've got people in lockdown situations, like it's one day at a time. And one of the things I remember doing is just like, look, let's just meet frequently, because I actually increased the frequency that I met with certain people on my team, because I knew that every day was different emotionally. And some days you had it and you had the energy, and some days you just didn't, right? And I found that having a little bit of a structure, even if it's a 10-minute, kind of, hey, how you're doing? What are we working on today? Was kind of enough to kind of push the ball down the field, I guess. But that was a learning for me. So redesigning, the structure of the day, redesigning how I worked with teams was probably the biggest challenge. I don't know if I did a great job of it. I feel like we definitely come back to the side of it. But that was probably the largest challenge, because, the people problems are usually the hardest problems.
Yeah. And,
in what we've all gone through, and many are still going through actually, around the world, just has put all that to the test, so. Yeah.
I just listening to you, I'm reflecting that despite you having an enormous amount of complexity of problems and the scale that you're probably operating in, and you're on the other side of the world, yet we're all doing it all together. So hearing your response is validating, and it's also humbling that together we're experiencing quite the struggle of our career right now. And you're right. I think we are still in it, but hopefully we recognize we're all in it together. So the importance of creating diverse product and design teams and designing for a diverse audience, it's clear, it's critical, it's something you and I feel deeply passionate about. We have spent many times brainstorming and talking about it. Yet I think you and I probably would be raising our hands first saying that it is not easy. It's not
Hmm.
something that is easy. With that
Mm,
said, how do you approach continuing to improve designing for diversity and inclusion?
mm. Yeah. Well, I think there's some basic tools when you think about basically developing a healthy research practice that it should be fairly obvious at this point. That you need to be talking to your customers. You need to be uh, getting yourself as proximate to them and their needs and their experiences, right? No matter where they are. Because that's where you're going to get the most opportunities for innovation. That's where you're not going to miss critical insights that um, can make or break your product. But I think usually when we talk about this conversation, it is about how do you build diverse teams.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the main point to get across is that it requires very committed work, right? I think a lot of people want this problem to be something that can be um, fairly easily solved, and so it takes a commitment, from everything from thinking through how you incentivize managers to if you have a larger organization, how are you incentivizing those managers to go out and build networks that are diverse, that go beyond their immediate kind of friend circle, which is going to look very much like them and it's probably going to look fairly homogenous, right? How do you encourage them to make sure that they're building a network outside of their immediate circles? How do you set those expectations that we're going to hire a diverse workforce? Um, how do you think about where you're getting your talent from so that you figure out, are we looking in the same places again and again, or are we actually putting in the work to find other places that we can be getting talent from? When it comes down to, um, I think you can look at like the kind of seniority of talent because there are different challenges. For instance, if you're hiring in junior talent or newer to the industry talent, how are you looking at your interview process to eliminate bias from that, or to reduce the amount of bias coming in? Because we could talk about, usually when the diversity thing comes up, there's always someone who's talking about, well, let's not lower the bar, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it was a question what our bar is, um, and and so there's always bias in the hiring process, and by bias, I think the important thing to get across is there's gatekeeping, right? There's always, and when I was talking to this with some other designers recently about all the times where each of us got a shot where someone took a bet on us, right?
Yeah.
That led us in the door, and maybe we got into a role that was a little bit of a stretch or whatever. But that happens to everyone, right? But some people get the benefit of the doubt, and some people don't. And I feel like companies need to get better at um, seeing potential in people and investing in them early on. I think larger companies need to get better at how they onboard and support diverse people. In my case, I'm thinking a lot about, thinking a little bit more US focused and a little bit more about getting more Black designers into the industry. And one thing that I find that it becomes a struggle is if you end up in a larger company and you don't have a great manager, you're going to have a rough time and likely spin out, right? And that happens a lot. And I don't think companies think enough about how you support that young talent. I think they just assume that it'll happen, and it doesn't. On the executive level, again, it goes back to building up a network so that when you have that big role, you're not like, okay, let's start this process or let's use the Rooney rule to kind of find, diverse talent to force as a forcing function for us um, to look for diverse people and spend a little time. But I feel like you ought to have relationships in place so when that role opens up, you've got people that you're not just cold calling, right? So, and then in order to do that, you've got to invest time in building those relationships very proactively. There's no easy way around it. You have to actually care about this, and you have to invest the time. Um, and I think that's the hard truth that a lot of people have a hard time accepting.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I think the thing is like it needs to intrinsically want to be something that you make a commitment to It cannot
Hmm.
be something that you can just check a box off, because you need to
Yeah,
build
or hire someone to
long-term
do for you
relationships.
or things like that. No,
Yeah, in an
you
authentic
have
way.
to be on it. The people, and you can just look at the people that have been best at it are the people who are just they're looking deeper. They're
Yeah.
not just looking at the people that their team is surfacing for them or the recruiters giving them. They're doing the work to identify and pay attention to who else is out there.
Yeah.
Um, you know,
Well, I know this is just like, and I thank you for continuing to be an advocate, and a spokesperson, but there's more work for both of us to do.
oh
Um,
yeah.
so I love this next question because I feel only you could answer it. That's how I feel about this question. Where for me, you have this unparalleled lens of designing for consumer audiences. I think it's your talent, it's your gift, it is the impact, the incredible impact you've been able to deliver for the brands that you have been able to work for. You have said in the past that you've been heavily influenced by digital cultures. It's just like that's what has inspired you. And I'm curious if that is still the case, if that is what inspires you, or what does inspire you now, what inspires your designs.
Yeah, I think this is a fun question now because I've spent a couple of years living outside the U.S. and in particular Japan, and I think for a lot of designers, this place is something that people aspire to come to, or if they've already been here, they come back to on some regular basis, and it's not something that needs to be really sold or explained. But I think I've grown or been inspired tremendously by living outside of where I'm from. And, I think I would credit it to, getting really far out of your comfort zone. It kind of rewires your brain a lot. And in Japan, because it has such a unique culture and that's, very old culture and has developed over time, it has lots of small differences, even with the Western influences that have come in, kind of modern Japanese society, it still has lots of small things and new things to learn every day. And so being in an environment where you're forced to learn every day, where you're forced to work harder to do even the basics, just I find mostly energizing. It's challenging sometimes. It's, very, like I said, very humbling, consistently. I find it very stimulating. And then I think from a kind of design perspective specifically, there are some areas of Japanese culture because I feel like you could get some of what I described from just moving anywhere where they're not speaking your language every day.
So, Ian, you are American, right?
Mm-hmm.
You are living and based in Japan.
Mm-hmm.
You design for one of the most globally recognized brands that is out there. You and I love to travel, obviously, and learn
Mm-hmm.
new experiences. You and I love the Netherlands, for example. In my
Mm-hmm.
mind, you are a man of the world. It's just like that is how I've defined you. But people that are watching this, or just listening in, they may not have had the experience that you have for designing for
Mm-hmm.
these wide global audiences. They're just starting
Mm-hmm.
up. So what are some best practices or tips that you would provide to them about how to actually design for an international footprint? And what I ask is, like, should they be thinking about that on day one, or is it something
Mm-hmm.
that they incorporate later on?
Well, I think it's hard for startups to think about that day one because the resources are really usually limited, that sort of thing. And you're just trying to figure out, are there people in the world that this product fits with? But it is something you start to think about really early. So, for instance, if you're designing UI, you're going to need to be able to design for other languages and translations, which is always like, does this work in German? That's
It
always
never
the
works in German.
thing that spooks, right?
Yeah, it's too long.
German or Polish is also pretty long, and so like there's those realities that you have to like think through. Is like are we able to translate these things well, not just from a string perspective, but also from a does the language make sense, which is something that a lot of organizations still struggle with. It's not as easy as just putting it into Google Translate or something like that. So I think being able to speak in the language of more people around the world is important. But I think you can also you can you will gain a lot from taking that global perspective early. I can remember in Foursquare days, and I think this happened even before I got there. Like, I'm not taking credit for this at all, but Foursquare had such a community around it, and people were so passionate about it in the world. I remember that I think the translation in Turkey was done by just a community of Turkish people. And Foursquare gave the power to edit and translate to those groups, and so they use their small size but their the rabid community to help improve the experience, right? And so I think thinking with that global mindset early makes a lot of sense. I think when you get to a bigger phase, companies will send their research teams out to other regions to get insights on how people are using it, which is usually pretty helpful. But I think one thing that I've learned in particular being out here is there is value in doing much more longitudinal research. Instead of saying we're going to be here for a couple of weeks, let's think about what if we spent months here, 3 months, 6 months. And I think you get a lot more from that experience. And I think you can get enough that will feed an organization for years from doing that. And so that's like kind of more of a new learning for me, is that when you're embedded in a market, and ideally living in that region and experiencing the challenges firsthand, it changes your experience. Having the experience of something gives you much deeper wisdom and knowledge, right, than having someone play it back to you in a document. Those little frustrations suddenly become very, very big. And so the more you can kind of embed yourself into these other markets, or these places that are outside of wherever you're working, I think the better you'll be able to make decisions that impact more people. And the more, I mentioned this before, but the more you'll identify the real critical insights that can shape the future of your product.
Yeah, it makes sense. And also you just develop that empathy, right? You have the ability to have the time and the appreciation and understand and really empathize because you become one of those.
Right. And then also I think it's you might think that and this is true just thinking inclusively, but when you design for a particular use case, let's say in a particular market, let's say, I don't know, a place where bandwidth is really constrained, and you might start to invest and be like, look, we're in a place in the world where your connection's intermittent, or people hop from Wi-Fi to Wi-Fi networks, and the way our experience kind of fails and when the connection isn't reliable, just is basically unacceptable as an experience. We would not want that to happen in the US, right? We wouldn't allow that to happen. It would not be, so feeling that pain is, helps you reprioritize what you think is actually important. But if you fixed in this example of like how your application degrades when the connection isn't reliable, you obviously will have impact to where that is true in these markets that might have more established like network connections, right? And so there's this, I think taking away the misnomer that you're serving for the very edge case. No, you're not, because chances are other people have that experience too, in a different context, right? And so, but you're thinking more inclusively early, which helps everyone. And I think like there's a little bit of a mind shift that needs to happen sometimes with teams on that.
Yeah. There's something that you said earlier just about you placing yourself in Japan where it clearly isn't designed for you. I feel that I also grew up where I was a minority, and I just knew very early on nothing was designed for me, but I feel as if that's my superpower now as a designer. It allows me a perspective and allows hopefully to design more inclusively. All right. So last question I have for you. You have led product design teams for decades. Listen, I'm not going to age us here. It's for a long time. You're widely experienced. What changes have you seen in the industry, or maybe what changes were you hoping to see that we have not actually made change on yet?
Well, I mean, I think just thinking in the domain of software and digital, I've seen, a lot of changes. Like one of the biggest shifts were kind of moving to a mobile focused world. That was kind of a big shift that took a long time, and probably in some ways, still in progress in some places. But that was kind of a big mind shift for designers, I think. I think the change that I feel like we're probably still underestimating is designing more inclusively.
Mm.
I think we're still getting to a phase where we're thinking about, not just thinking about designing for different like cultures and ethnicities, but also thinking about differently abled people and doing all these things up front, um, because it's very very layered, right?
Mm.
And it's something that it takes a long time for people to kind of rewire their defaults to think about, and it requires an organization to rewire their defaults. And so I feel like that's something that I think I'd love to see the industry start to do better. It's something I want to be doing better, into thinking not just about, say, what's the experience, the Black experience or whatever, but actually thinking outside of myself more, right? To other folks who might be considered like on the fringes or themselves might be considered a minority, or underserved in some way. And so I feel like we can never do enough of that, right? And I feel like it's probably something important for the world to be doing more, is everyone thinking outside of themselves more. But I just think operationally and how we educate ourselves about these things is just there's just so much work to be done there. It's an area that I'd love to see us push on in the industry.